Senator Madigan.
Thank you, Chair. Initially, I referred to the MDBA proposal to release 2,750 gigalitres of water per year for 9 out of every 10 years to be piggybacked on the Murray and Murrumbidgee water and on top of several smaller rivers. Ultimately, people fear causing massive riverbank notch erosion, damage to floodplain farming, land and property, with stock and crop damage and loss, with long-term income loss to people and towns throughout the 3 basin states. How can a mere $200 million offered by the federal government ever hope to cover the enormous loss generated throughout the basin by this proposal?
I think, Senator Madigan, the proposal you're referring to is the long-term average recovery amount that has been part of the basin plan that was came into law at the end of 2012. So is that what you're referring to? So we don't have a proposal that is about delivering 2,750 in one go. So I just need to be clear on what your proposal is.
The fear is amongst communities is that you're proposing to piggyback your water on top of current water that's running down the river system. We've already seen massive problems with inundation of land. We've got the constraints problems along the rivers that I'm sure you're well aware of, and people are concerned that the federal government is offering $200 million to cover proposed flooding events, and they're saying it's not enough.
Look, Senators, probably if I just sort of run through the whole breadth of the basin plan, which, as I said, has been now adopted by government and agreed by the states, and it's currently being implemented. The recovery amount, the 2,750, in the first instance, there is an adjustment process that's underway now to look at whether there's potential offsets to that amount, as well as looking at whether there is an opportunity to adjust it for further environmental benefit. The constraint strategy, which you say $200 million is earmarked for that, is part of that process. The government's invested, and the Department of Environment would probably say more about that. I think it's getting on close to now about over $4 billion that has been contracted in infrastructure works for farmers, and that's part of the effort to improve the efficiency for farm infrastructure operators and individual farmers as part of the basin plan. So the $200 million you referred to is really only to help look at the options for constraints. Some of the things I was talking to Senator Rhondda about whether you needed to provide additional access bridges or look at easements and those sort of things. By far the bulk of the funds that are being spent on the basin plan are for infrastructure investments, and which is now far overtaking water purchase.
Can I just follow up on Senator Madigan's question? Are you negotiating with any landowners right now about purchasing easements or land for water delivery?
No, at this stage we're only at the doing the feasibility work, the business case work for governments to make their decisions in the future.
Are you taking charge of that, Dr. Dickson, or the department?
No, we're responsible for, as I said, assisting the states now as they're doing their constraints. They're doing the constraint studies. We're providing their assistance. Up until last year, we were doing the pre-feasibility work. The basin states have now made the decision to continue with it, so we're now assisting the states in doing that further work.
Who ultimately will be responsible for negotiating these easements and purchasing them?
That's probably going to be a decision for the states when they go ahead with it, how they want to manage that process.
So
We've been currently doing it on behalf of the states for some of the other works that we manage, such as the Living Murray works where there are associated easements. So it could be that the states might ask us to do that, or they may use a different process.
And under your modelling, how many landowners would you need to negotiate with under the current plan?
Look, I don't think I can answer that. I don't
You
think
don't
we've
have
done
the
enough work.
information, or?
I don't think we've done enough work to really identify it, because it depends what.
I mean, this goes to Senator Manning's question. We've signed up to this plan. We've decided to spend billions of dollars, and you can't tell us how many people are going to be impacted, even in a ballpark sense.
It all depends, Senator, on how many. Sort of what level flows and what government's decisions are.
Specifically, how many would you need to negotiate with? I mean, obviously we've just signed this $200 million package on some information about what the requirements would be. How many landowners do you think we need to negotiate to see the plan to fruition? You don't know, or you can't tell us?
We haven't yet done enough work to be able to estimate how many landholders would be involved. As I said, at this stage we're only doing the feasibility, and we're only talking about the constraint strategy here. This is just one element of the basin plan.
I'm not just talking about the constraint strategy. I mean, obviously this was a key element of the design of the plan. I'm talking about how many people are going to be impacted with flooding on their properties and therefore needing a form of compensation. We don't know. We don't have an answer to that question.
The levels, as I said to Senator Rushton, that we're looking at are really quite low levels. These are floods that happen anyway. The type of flows that we're looking at do not create the sort of flooding that builds fears in people's mind of massive devastation.
No, it does impact their business,
so
as you'd appreciate, Dr Dickson.
Yeah.
If it only takes a small flow and cows can't graze there anymore, or you can't grow crops there anymore, that's going to impact on people's livelihoods. And we don't know how many people are going to be impacted.
The whole purpose of the constraint strategy is to be able to avoid those impacts. So there's things that you can do, such as when the timing of when the flows come through. When if you go early enough, it sometimes creates beneficial soil moisture for people to graze. And you need to avoid the times when people need to move stock around or go from one place to another. So the whole purpose of this work is to be able to avoid impacts as much as possible, and to be able to identify whether or not you need to either provide things such as structures to help people get over those impacts, or whether there is such things as easements which we need to negotiate, which is what we have done in the past.
Which of course, Senator, goes very much to what Mr Papps, as the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, was outlining in his previous evidence, that much of the work he undertakes as the person who actually administers the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holdings is to work with local landowners and local communities to ensure that decisions about the timing and volume of releases of Commonwealth environmental water are made in a way that avoids negative impacts in the local community, possibly delivers complementary positive impacts if the right decisions are made in the right way. It is always important in these discussions, and I know you appreciate it, and I'm sure Senator Madigan does as well, but sometimes when other people look at the Hansard afterwards, they don't. It's important to understand that the bulk of damaging flooding activities that occur through the river system occur as a result of major unregulated flood events. That the basin plan will have no impact on the nature of those types of events, because of course, just as droughts will still happen under the basin plan, floods will still happen under the basin plan. The question comes down to how an entitlement, a body of water, a very large body of water admittedly, of potentially 2,750 gigalitres, is used, and used in a careful way. And certainly the government is very committed to ensure that it's used in a way where we don't have adverse impacts on landowners, and the work of the constraints management strategy is indeed about working through how, as the plan is finalised, because there is a significant point that will come next year with the decisions around the adjustment mechanism, how, as the plan is finalised, the we can, if required, invest funding to ensure that such negative impacts on landowners are compensated for should they arise with that finalisation that will come from the adjustment mechanism.
Senator Madigan.
Thank you, Chair. Some would say science is clear that we're going to have reductions in rainfall, less water in the basin storages. We'll likely have reduced flows to food growing areas with further reductions from evaporation and seepage. Flows strong enough to reach the lower lakes and to clear the Murray mouth will be impossible. I seek the NDBA's urgent response as to why it believes that it'll have enough additional water to release to piggyback over existing river water to send down a 2,500 kilometre system in an attempt to clear the Murray mouth, when current reduced flows have already given cause to dredge the river mouth once again.
Thank you for your question. The issue of future climate change certainly is a challenge, probably a challenge for certainly in future years. The basin plan, under the basin plan, there was always an expectation that I think is for over 10% of years there was always going to be a likelihood of needing to dredge the Murray mouth. It was never intended that there was going to be sufficient water to prevent that happening in releasing those flows. So it is not surprising that with the current situation over the last year or so that we've needed to start dredging the Murray mouth. The other point, of course, is that the basin plan is not yet fully implemented, so it's probably sort of early days to make that assessment. But there always was an expectation that dredging would be required.
Perhaps if I could just add to that, Russell James, Executive Director of Policy and Planning at the MDBA. One of the important things about the basin water reforms is that the Commonwealth has invested a large amount of money to improve the efficiency of irrigation systems. You talked about leakage in channels and so on. So, for example, when we were visiting Colliamberley Irrigated last week, they said that the investment that they have made and government has also helped them make over the last 10 years or so has increased their efficiency so that the water they take from the river to get to the farm gate, so farmers can then use it, the efficiency has increased from previously 25% leakage, so 25% losses, now to only around 5%. So what's really happening here is that irrigators are able to really, grow the same amount of product, but using a lot less water in doing that, and that's an important part of the reform that's sort of sometimes lost.
So, this question concerns the lower lakes and Murray mouth, and a refusal by the NDBA to acknowledge it's no longer a viable solution with huge volumes of fresh water worth billions annually wasting away through evaporation and scouring. The MDBA ignores the question of revitalising the lower lakes by returning them to an estuarine state. With inexpensive modifications, I would suggest, and with the help from barrages, Southern Ocean water, assisted by 1,800 gigs a year of fresh water, would provide the means to keep the mouth clear and the lake productively alive and save 2,700 gigalitres for growers and for the environment. Is the NDBA familiar with the Lock Zero proposal, and what is your response to that?
Senator, these issues that you just outlined came up a lot in the development of the basin plan, and it was not a solution that where governments wanted to go. We're familiar with the Lock Zero and have done extensive work, not only recently but also during the drought, on what some of the implications might be.
So Senator, if I can add, firstly, in relation to the water recovery targets under the basin plan, not all of the 2,750 gigalitres is earmarked for end of system flows, so you shouldn't be assuming that that is all designated to make its way to the end, because that's not the way the basin plan has been structured. Secondly, to the broader point of your issue, you can certainly say that you could remove the barrages, put a lock or some other structure around Wellington or somewhere towards the end of the river channel. And I hear people say from time to time that would be returning the lakes to their natural state. And indeed, of course, before man came along and built the barrages, there weren't barrages there. But there also weren't locks, weirs and dams upstream. There also wasn't in excess of 10,000 gigalitres, even under the basin plan, of extraction occurring upstream, which of course has a dramatic impact on the downstream flow and the flow of fresh water into those lakes. So I've always acknowledged that the implementation or construction of the barrages has meant that the lakes have gone from an oceanally estuarine environment to a predominantly freshwater environment. But if you were to remove them, they wouldn't go back to a natural state in terms of what occurred pre-development of the basin. They would become a greater or a more saltwater environment than they were previously because of that reduced inflow as a result of our development. Now, I fully support the utilisation of water upstream for economic and agricultural activity, but we have to acknowledge that that has consequences downstream, and that is exactly what the Basin Plan seeks to try to do, to balance those upstream and downstream needs. People will, as they have forever, will no doubt continuously debate whether it provides the right balance and the correct answers. But as Dr. Dickson has said, governments collectively of different political persuasions in considering how to best manage the basin have not believed that decommissioning of the barrages and construction of some new lock or weir would be the solution. Instead, it's believed that having a sustainable cap on extractions across the basin is the solution, and that's what the Basin Plan seeks to shift towards. But we shouldn't forget that under the Basin Plan, it is still allowing for a very significant level of extraction of water for productive purposes, which is incredibly important to our economy and the communities that you and Senator Canavan and Senator Ruston and myself all represent. I'll better look around to see if there's anybody I've missed there. Others too.
They do too.
They do too. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yes, indeed. Everybody except Senator Singh, actually.
I care.
Senator Singh cares. That's important. But
Minister, last question. Minister, earlier you said that the plan is still being finalised in some way. Could you explain to me, in 2013, the Senate voted on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So the Senate people in the place voted for a plan that is still open to finalisation. So people didn't know what they were voting on.
No, Senator, that's not correct. The structures around how the plan is implemented, and therefore what all of the different components of it will finally look like, indeed have a number of processes to still go through, because the Senate equally in 2013 voted to put within the Water Act terms for the adjustment mechanism, the Sustainable Diversion Limits Adjustment Mechanism, which then became a part of the Basin Plan that the Parliament accepted in 2013. Now that adjustment mechanism provides a capacity for up to 650 gigalitres of the 2,750 to be offset through environmental works and measures, through the more efficient use of water for environmental purposes, but also potentially for an additional 450 gigalitres to be recovered, taking that figure potentially up to 3,200 gigalitres of recovery, subject to a range of conditions. All of the work underpinning that adjustment mechanism is subject to the authority and the department and the states doing a body of work that leads to the Ministerial Council, the Murray-Darling Basin Ministerial Council, making some decisions in the middle of next year. So that is why there is some variance around it, but that is all completely reflected in the plan that was adopted by the Parliament and completely reflected in the legislation that was adopted by the Parliament.
Minister, when you go out and you speak to people at the coalface who are affected by our decisions in this place and the Murray-Darling Basin plan, they're terribly concerned, Minister, that I saw, for instance, the other day, minutes of a meeting with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority that was taken very studiously by a member of this particular community. When I saw the minutes that was printed up of this meeting by the NDBA, you'd think you're at two different meetings. And this is the concern of people. If you speak to farmers, you speak to irrigators, you speak to people in the towns, I just don't get where this whole thing is going, because I can tell you now, there seems to be a great void of difference between the rhetoric and the reality in the communities. I'm at a loss to understand.
Senator, I'm sure if you want to put some specific questions or allegations around minutes or what happens at meetings, then Dr. Dickson and her team can respond to those, and should respond to those if there are particular concerns in that regard.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.